All right. Can everyone see me okay? All righty. Now I learned something valuable. I may have mentioned this the last time, but Zoom will kind of superpose the miniature view of itself on the right side of the screen, and it was obscuring stuff that I was writing. So we've learned that now. So I'm gonna just try and keep all my stuff off to the left, just so you know. All righty. Screen sharing time. Okay. So here we are. I've got my browser window. I've got code. This up high. Right. So here's the README. What we're doing in this assignment is we are creating a full stack application composed of two parts. First part is a JSON API powered by Rails. And the second part is a UI app, which is written in Angular. The UI app is mostly complete. It's got like view stuff set up. We like, look, you can see we've got like UI related functionality. All this stuff exists already. We've got HTML file all tricked out. So that much is good. What we were assigned to do is go into the services directory and fiddle with this file, calendarapi.js. This file is, it holds a custom service called Calendar API. We've injected it with the HTTP service that we can write HTTP stuff there. And it is responsible for handling all of the HTTP requests related to our API. It has methods available for accessing and performing CRUD on all three resources that our application is going to deal with. Cool. Well, let's put that aside. Calendar API is where we're going to be doing most of our work. And the current state of it is that it doesn't really have much. Doesn't have any controllers, doesn't have any models, doesn't have any migrations. The only thing it has are routes. We come and see here, there are routes for profiles, routes for calendars, and routes for events. So this is the resource shortcut for drawing the routes, and it's a very convenient way to write it, but it's not very explicit. If we want to see the list of routes kind of spelled out, make that bigger. You can say Rails routes. Am I not inside the, oh, not in the right directory, sorry. There we go. Okay, so here's a list of all of the various different routes that exist in this app. You can see that some of these are nested. So it's like profiles, profile ID, calendars, right? And that actually lines up with this. If you see calendars only index create, when you nest your resources like that, it puts it inside on the URL as well. So the index and create actions happen at this URL for calendars. Profiles just have normal CRUD stuff at the /profiles route. There's nothing special about that at all. Calendars have their show, update, and destroy not nested. This is called shallow nesting, just in case you're curious. It's a fairly common way of dealing with nesting when you have multiple, nesting things multiple times. If we were to forego that and just be nesting that stuff straight, the routes would get pretty hairy pretty quickly. A good rule of thumb when dealing with nesting routes is that you don't want to nest more than 2 levels deep. So shallow routes are a way of around that. The I guess you could call them the aggregate routes for index and create. Things that don't refer to a specific item are nested, and things that do refer to a specific item are handled at /resource rather than being nested. So calendars get their index and create at these URLs, and everything else at these URLs. And similarly, events get their index and create at these URLs, and everything else at these URLs. Okay, before I go any further, I want to just make sure that I have everything set up. So I'm going to run bundle install. Great. And I'm going to create the database. Okay. There are some tests that are provided. I like tests, as you may have guessed. So I'm going to be using them as I go through this. But they were optional. You were not required to use them. But there are a number of tests. And they don't work yet because there's stuff that we haven't defined, like calendar. It doesn't know what the heck a calendar is at the moment. So let's go back to the README. Oh, I'm reading. Okay. And we don't have to do anything to set up UI, which is nice. That's just all done. Cool. So yes, we're going to be serving up each part of the app independently. We'll come back to this. Calendar API, routes have already been written. A script to load example data has already been written. And we need to create 3 resources: a profile, a calendar, and an event. One profile is associated with many calendars. Every calendar must be associated with a profile, and every event must be associated with a calendar. Or, in short, make migrations, models, and controllers. Okay. Let's pause there. I don't want to look at the UI stuff right now. I don't want to look at the reach features. I'm only going to focus on the Rails API. Get that working first. Why? Well, for starters, the front end is basically done. There's not a whole lot to do here. And the only missing piece involves using the Rails API. So getting that working will basically mean that the Angular app is done as well. So you may be wondering, like, well, how do we know that the Rails app is working if we don't have our Angular app plugged in? The answer is tests. The tests that we have in this particular application can actually check not only things like properties of the model and so on, but things like relationships, and they can also like practice hitting routes so that you know what happens if you get a GET request, for example, at some particular URL. And there's actually 2 buckets of those specs. So it says, oh, if you do a get at /profiles, it's handled, and it responds to the list of all profiles as JSON. And the tests will actually take care of hitting the necessary things in order for our app to be tested. Okay. Let's start off with the place where we should always start, which is thinking about our data. We have 3 entities here: a profile, a calendar, and an event. Before we do anything with regard to associations, before we build any controllers, before we do anything else, we need to actually create tables for these 3 things. Okay. So in order to create a table, we need to create migrations. Migrations are the way in which we effect change in the database that doesn't involve just like changing the data itself. Structural change to the database, if you will. So let's go ahead and create a migration. By the way, as we're going along, I want to give you guys the opportunity to just jump in with questions. If I can't handle it in that moment, I will let you know. But otherwise, please feel free to ask me about any step that I'm going through here. Particularly, try and pay attention to the procedure that I'm using to go through this, because Rails is kind of formulaic in terms of what you need to do and when. So we're going to be kind of going in certain steps in order to minimize the likelihood of something going belly up. So please ask questions. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a migration for each resource. I'm going to start with the profile, because I know that profile doesn't depend on anything else, even though I'm actually not going to include the associations yet. I'm just going to go and I'm going to create all three resources, create migrations for all three resources and get them into the database just in there so that I have stuff to work with. So I'm going to create profiles. And I can just run it like that. Now in my migrate directory, I have a place to create a table called profiles. What is a profile? Well, I have an explanation of what the properties of a profile are. Not this one. Here in this README file. So what is a profile? Well, profile is a given name, a surname, a URL for a background image, and a default event duration in minutes. So based on that description, I am interpreting this as a string, another string, and a number. To actually create those columns in the table, I use the reference to the table builder T. I say t.string, give me a string column called given name. Give me another string column called surname. Give me another string column called background image URL. And finally, give me an integer. Why integer? Because I don't think people are going to deal with half minutes. That's just thinking about the context of a calendar. If you want to use a different number value, that's fine. But I think in the context, using an integer makes the most sense. And in addition to that, I want to include timestamps. Good to have. They don't cost you anything. Cool. All right, I've created a migration file. What am I going to do next? Am I going to write more code? No, I'm not going to write more code. I'm going to test the code that I've written. Let me run this migration. See if it passes. First of all, is it like just syntactically valid? Seems to be. It says create table profiles. But I don't want to believe that. I want to actually check it for myself. So I will. Go into Rails DB. And it takes me into my database. And I can see a list of the tables that exist. It looks like there is now a profiles table in my database. And if I do \d profiles, I see all of the columns that I defined in my migration. Great. So it looks like my migration was fine. That's successful. Excellent. I no longer need to worry about that piece of the puzzle. If I'm curious, I can query the table, but nothing's going to come out because it doesn't exist. There's no data in there yet. Okay, cool. We stopped, we checked. Now we move forward. Let's make another migration. Instead of creating profiles, this time we're going to create calendars. Rather than opening up the file and typing all of that stuff in by hand, I'm going to use the generator syntax. And that allows me to type in all of the properties that I want the migration to create in the table in the command line interface. So what does a calendar have? a calendar has a name, a description, an indicator of whether or not the calendar is currently visible in the UI. So there's some UI property that is stored in the database, and a color for that calendar, which is also a UI property. Based on the context, I would say that this is a string, that this is a Boolean, and that this is also probably a string. Could be represented as a number, but more common to see that represented as a string. So I'm going to choose to use a string there. Description. So description, it could be short, it could be long. Given that we're talking about a calendar, you know, I think it's worthwhile to look at like a Google Calendar. So let me pull up an example. So here's a Google Calendar, right? So if I create a new event, I have a description. And a description, this is not a normal input, this is a text box, which suggests that your description could potentially be fairly long. If I'm following Google's example on this, I think it makes sense, that description could potentially be lengthy, and I want to account for that. So rather than making description a string, I'm going to make it text, which is the column type that Postgres uses for long blocks of text. So let's go ahead and do that. These columns are, again, name, description, is visible, and color. So name is a string. Description is text. Is visible is a Boolean. And color, I've decided, is a string. So you can see that there's sort of a pattern here in this syntax, right? It's the name of the column, colon, data type. However, string is actually the default data type. So we don't really need to include that. We can just give the name of the column and it will assume that it's a string unless we say otherwise. Okay. Let's take a look at our migrations. This is the profile. Ah, there we are. Name, description, is visible, color. Cool. And oh, I forgot to include the timestamps. Okay, cool. So we've got another migration. This time it's for calendars. Those properties line up with what I said. Name is a string, description is text, is visible as a Boolean, and color is a string. Okay, I'm satisfied with this migration. So what do I do next? Someone jump in. What's my next step here?
Run the migration again.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to run the migration so that I can see whether or not it works. Moving slowly here, one step at a time. Moving carefully. It's harder to go back than it is to go forwards. So let's take a look at this. We run the migration. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. DT. Looks like there's now a calendars table that's been created. If I look at the columns on calendars, it gives me ID, name, description, is visible, color, and timestamps. Great. And I can do that whole thing with the select again, but there's no data. Okay. I'm now satisfied with this migration. What am I going to do next?
Work on the next thing.
Next migration. Note that I'm not touching the models in anything here. The reason I'm not is that they're not really relevant yet. We're not talking about using Rails console. We're not talking about accessing the data in Rails yet. We're just talking about structuring the table. The migrations don't depend on the model, but the models depend on the migrations. Given that that's the case, I prefer to start with the migrations and get the entire structure of the table set up before I start worrying about the models. If I can. It's not always possible, but I try. All right, so let's make that third migration. Create events. Event is our third resource. And an event has a name, a description, a date/time where the event starts, and when it ends. I think that's actually fairly explicit in what we ought to be doing. So we're going to want a name. We're going to want a description, which will be a text type of data. And then we're going to want to have a column called start, which is a date time. Another one called end, which is also a date time. Alrighty. Let's take a look at our file. Oh, shoot, I did it again. I'm sorry, guys. Dang it. Okay, timestamps. Good to have. Events have a name, a description, a start, and an end. Okay. Rails DB migrate. Migration seems to have been successful. Rails DB. Okay. Looks like there's now an events table. It has the columns I want. Name, description, start, end. And I can grab the table even though it has no contents. So I'm able to query it. Okay. Now I'm going to stop and take stock. What I've done so far is I have created migrations for my 3 resources. The resources are not related yet, but they exist on their own. In order to actually perform the association, I'm going to need to make some more changes to the database, and I'll get there soon, but I'm not there yet. I'm just creating the tables. Why do that? I could define the relationships in the migrations where I create the tables, so why not? Well, migrations represent steps in the development of your database, kind of like commits do in a repository. And just like you do with commits, you want to make your commits small so that if you have to roll something back, it doesn't mean that you lose a lot of stuff. You're more flexible by keeping your migrations small. Cool. So we've got those 3 migrations. We've got those 3 tables. I'm going to create models now. So I want to have a model. Come on, right click. And it doesn't really matter what order I make them in. Okay, and profile. Oh, shoot. Why is that truncating? There we are. Anyone know how to make this bar longer? I don't. I really wish I could. That's like things I wish I knew about Atom. Okay, so we've got files for our 3 models. What is a model? A model is a Ruby class. Specifically, it's a Ruby class that inherits from some other Ruby class, which defines what a model does and how a model behaves. In this case, it's application record. Didn't used to be the case that this thing existed, but the idea comes from something that was previously being used only for controllers. Namely, before, every model was inheriting from active record base, which is a class defined within active record, which defines all the core base functionality of a model. But by adding this application record thing here, there's something nice that happens, which is that if I want something to be true for every one of my models, I can put it here. And I don't need to write it in every single one of those places. So it's a smart design, not something that we're going to be leveraging right now, but that's why it exists. That's why that is the case. So given that, let's inherit from application record. Yeah. Okay. And stop. We've created a model. So how do we test whether or not our model works? If we use RailsDB to check our migrations, we use blank to check our models.
Can you do like profile.new
Okay, but specifically in what?
in the console, Rails console?
Yes, that is what I was looking for. Rails console. RailsDB is to migrations as RailsC is to models. Okay. So let's actually take a look. First of all, does profile exist? Yes. When we go into RailsC, it recognizes that there's a thing called profile. Now, you can't just do anything with profile alone, which is why it's complaining here. But I could do something like profile.all. And I can call that method. And I know now that profile is in fact a model and that it'll work. I can even start creating records. So properties of a profile are given name, surname, URL, event duration. So none of these are mandatory. None of them are required fields. So I'm just going to use two of them, given name and surname, and not specify the others. And look, I can create a new person. That's cool. Oh, you know, let me change one of those properties. I'm going to specify some bogus URL. Wonderful. It's a picture of a duck. That's going to be the background image URL. Oh, shoot. Okay, I've defined that property. If I look at P, it's changed the property on the Ruby object. But none of this has happened in the database yet, by the way. The only time things happen in the database is when one of three methods is called: create, update, and save. Those are the only three methods that directly access the database. Anything else does not. It only interacts with the Ruby object. And in fact, the only reason create and update do is because under the hood, they call save. So if I say p.save, now it's been inserted into the database. Now that change has happened. And if I say profile.all, now there is a profile that exists. Cool. And I'm going to destroy it. All right. We did this. We have one model now. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit for the models because we're a little bit short on time. But that is the same process that we would use to create the other two models. And to ensure that they work correctly. So don't speed ahead like I'm doing right now, because that's when mistakes are likely to happen. Okay, so what have we got at this moment? Right now, we have 3 independent tables, each of which has its own model, which allows us to have a Ruby interface for interacting with the database. All that's left on the data layer is adding our associations. So how do we add an association? Well, under the hood, the thing that actually associates 2 tables is foreign keys. Foreign keys are the only way that tables can be interrelated. So if we want to relate one table to another table, we have to use foreign keys, which means we have to add a foreign key column to the child table so that it can refer to a particular parent. All right. Now, to do that, that is a structural change to the database, which means that we need to make a migration. Adding columns, deleting columns, altering columns, creating tables, destroying tables. Every one of those is a structural change to the database. Every one of those requires a migration. Okay, so Rails G migration. There is a certain pattern for doing this. Let's start with profile and calendar. I know from the directions that one profile is associated with many calendars. Every calendar is associated with one profile. So the pattern for this, for the generator, is add profile to calendars, which I guess you could say is shorthand for add a column called profile ID to the calendars table. This is another shorthand that you can do from the CLI. It makes the process of setting up a foreign key much faster. So I've created a migration. Close up app. All I'm caring about right now is DB. So after creating all 3 of those tables, now we have add profile to calendars. So what this actually is it references a built-in method in Active Record Migration called add reference. It adds a reference to the calendars table for a resource called profile, and it applies the foreign key constraint. Foreign key constraint ensures that we can only choose foreign key values that exist in the table that we're referencing. That's an important thing to have for data integrity. Okay, so we've created the migration. Let's run it. Rails DB migrate. We changed the database, we ran a migration, so we use Rails DB to check our work. Okay, so I'm gonna look at my tables, calendars, events, profiles, those all still exist. If I look at the calendars table in particular, oh, not DT, D. The calendars table. This is the one that I added the column to just now, right? Because we inserted a foreign key called profile ID into the calendars table, referencing profile. And we see now we have a column called profile ID of type integer, and we see that we're indexing calendars on profile ID. This means that it's using the profile ID to be able to refer to some set of calendars. Finally, foreign key constraints we see that there is a foreign key. Profile ID references profiles ID, or the ID column on the profiles table. Okay, that's what we'd expect. If we were to look at profiles, profiles is unchanged, except that it now knows that it's referenced by a key on the calendars table. Okay, cool. The tables have been associated. Now let's go to another migration. This time, instead of adding a profile ID to the calendars table, we're going to add a calendar ID to the events table. And the foreign key will be called calendar ID. Okay, so we've generated it in our database. Here's a new migration. It's called add calendar to events. Add a reference to the events table for referencing a calendar with the foreign key constraint. Okay, let's test it. Does the migration pass? Yes, we were able to successfully run the migration. Now we go to Rails DB again. We check our tables. The only two tables that should be affected by this are calendar and events, but let's check profiles anyway. Yep, so profiles is exactly the same as we've left it. It has no idea about the relationship between calendars and events, only between itself and calendars. So let's look at events next. Events have all of the properties that they had before, but now they have a new property, calendar ID, which is an integer, and which references the ID on the calendars table. Cool, that is also what we would expect and what we hope for. And last but not least, we check the calendars table. And we see not only that it has its own foreign key constraint for profiles, but that it is itself referenced by the events table using the column calendar ID. Okay, let's pause for a minute. We've just finished all of our migrations. We do not need to do anything else as far as the database is concerned. We created 3 tables and we associated them. That is done. Done, totally done. What do we need to do next? Well, we have our migrations, we have our table set up, Postgres is all good to go. Now we want a way to be able to interact with that through Ruby. We have our models, but our models aren't aware of that relationship beyond having columns that they can recognize. We want to add methods to our models so that we can use the relationship more effectively. Specifically, we want to be able to say profile.calendars, calendar.events, event.calendar, calendar.profile. Those methods don't just come from nowhere. They're created by has many and belongs to. Just like attr accessor or attr reader generates getter and setter methods, has many and belongs to generate getter and setter, well, not quite getter and setter, but same idea, generate methods on our models. Okay, so we're done with DB. Let's go to the models. Okay, a model is associated with calendars, right? So a model has many calendars with an A, right? Okay, so this is going to create a calendars method on a profile. Every profile now has a .calendars method. Now we come to calendar. You say calendar belongs to a profile. Now every calendar has a profile method which references the profile that it's attached to. Okay. Similarly, a calendar has many events. And an event belongs to a calendar. Okay, that's it. That's pretty much all we need to do. However, there is one more thing that we need to add, and it's referenced in the README. I think it's referenced in the README. Well, it's something that you should, every calendar must be associated with profile. Every event must be associated with a calendar. It's not optional, which means if you were to destroy a calendar, what would happen to all of the events associated with that calendar? They can't exist without that calendar associated to them. So we need a way of ensuring that that never happens. Well, Rails provides us a mechanism for doing this, and it's called dependent destroy. And what it says is essentially, before you destroy me, destroy any dependent records I have. Destroy them first so that they don't exist without me. So what that means in practical terms is if we delete a calendar, it deletes all of its associated events and then deletes itself. If we delete a profile, it deletes all of its calendars and then deletes itself. But of course, to delete each one of its calendars, it also has to delete each one of its events. So if you delete a profile, all the associated calendars and every event associated with each of those calendars will be deleted first. It's a nice way of making sure that you don't have records left behind. Okay, so we did a lot. Let's check our work. Can we still create a profile? Yes. Can I reference a calendars method on the profile? Yes. There are no calendars associated, but the method works. Can I attach new calendars to that calendar? So I could say C equals, I actually can't do it that way. C equals calendar.new. And the name of the calendar is personal. I'll just call it personal. I don't care about any of the other properties right now. So I'll create a new calendar called personal. I'm not calling calendar.create. The reason I'm not calling calendar.create is that I cannot have a calendar that doesn't have a profile ID. If I just define calendar.create, well, I could actually set it in here in the properties. So that's not quite true. But I would have to specify which profile that calendar is attached to. Well, here's another way that I can attach it. I have my profile. It has a calendars collection. And I can append the new calendar to profile.calendars. Now you can see that personal calendar has a profile ID of 2. It refers to profile 2. And if I say p.calendars, it shows that collection. If I were to say c.profile, it shows my profile. Great. Okay, so I want to now add an event to my calendars. Let's see if I can get that to work. So I'm going to say e equals event.create. This time I'm going to call create because I want to confirm that I'm not talking nonsense. All right, so it's a party, and this event is associated with calendar 1. All right, let's see if that works. Works fine. Great. So we've created a new event associated with calendar 1, which is C. If I say c.events, that new event shows up. And if I say e.calendar, it refers me back to the calendar it's attached to. Okay. I've just tested all of the things in my model, pretty much, except one, the dependent destroy. So P was my profile, right? I say p.destroy, it should destroy itself, but before it does, it should destroy its calendar. And before its calendar destroys itself, the calendar should destroy the event. Okay, let's take a look at the SQL that was written, by the way, when we were doing this. This is the actual SQL code that was generated by Active Record. And it says delete from events, where events ID is 1, delete from calendars, where calendars ID is 1, and delete from profiles, where profiles ID is 1, is what's going on. It's writing the SQL to delete all events, and then delete all calendars, and then delete this particular profile. Excuse me. So now that we have that done, if I look for profile.all, it is empty. Calendar.all is also empty. And finally, event.all is empty too. So we know that both of our dependent destroy setups are working correctly. Stopping again. This is a breakpoint. Why? Well, our migrations are all done, and our models now have all of their methods. In short, the data layer to this application is finished. There is nothing more that I need to do in terms of creating or altering my models or my migrations. There's only one more step left on the back end, and that is to create the controllers, since the routes I know have already been built. Okay, then let's get to it. Before I do that, I'm just going to run my load script. There is, you remember you were provided with this script. It has some stuff. Profile, calendar, event. If I run it runs successfully. It gives me no errors. And now I'm going to have some sample data in my app. And that's going to be useful for playing around with the controllers as well. Okay, it's controller time. When we create a controller, it's just like creating a model in this respect, which I think was one of the great decisions that was made with Rails 5. So I'm going to make a profiles controller. Profiles controller, which inherits from application controller. Okay. When I create a controller, what are the things I need to have? Well, I need to have all of the basic methods for CRUD. Actually put index and create up here, because they're kind of distinct from the others. Okay. I need to have all of those things in order for my controller to work correctly. These are standard controllers. There's nothing special about them. However, there's also some other stuff that I'm going to need. I'm going to need to have strong parameters. So I'm going to say profile params is going to be my strong params method. I haven't filled in any of the content yet. And so the reason for that is I'm just going to create 2 copies of it. one called calendars controller. And then I'm going to make another copy and call it events controller. Okay, I now have 3 controller files: calendars, events, and profiles. The controllers exist. Now it's just a question of wiring them up and getting them working with the model. If I come back to Rails routes, you can see here which controller is associated with what. On a particular route, say get profiles, it's going to hit profiles index. I'll hit profiles create, profiles show, update, destroy, etc. I'm going to ignore put. Well, it doesn't actually matter because it just is going to call update. So let's go ahead and start making the profiles controller. So everything about profiles is standard. All of this is just the normal routes that you would have for a resource. So that kind of makes profiles a good place to start. So what do we do when we have index? Well, want to render all the profiles. Simple enough, right? Okay. If we want to create, we can say p equals file.new for some parameters that will specify if p.save successfully, then render JSON p. And that's just some icing on the cake. Else render JSON p.errors status can't spell. How the hell do you spell unprocessable? Unprocessable entity? Does that look right, guys? Unprocessable? I'm not really sure. Well, it's fine. So this is all of the architecture of create. All that's left is to decide what these params are going to be. So that's what we have this strong params method for. So we can take params, say require, or there's another one that's new. I think it's called fetch, but requires the one that is been around for a while. So require profile. And what this means is find the key in this hash that you give me and pluck off profile and and the value associated with it. And then permit, we're going to specify all the properties that you can give for a profile. So give a name, surname, background, image, URL, and default event duration. Drop that down the line. I want to stress that this is an area where people make silly mistakes. You know, everything's working fine, except for whatever reason, some property is coming up nil on your back end and you don't know why. Good chance you forgot to include it as a permitted property in your strong params. It's a very common error. Okay. Cool. So now I can plug in the profile params and that ought to work. Actually, now that we have a lot of stuff built, we could start running the tests and see if those are working. Ooh, we have an error. Migrations are pending. You guys may get this sometimes. I don't know what causes it, but sometimes the databases get out of sync. When you create your app, you're creating two databases, one which is called underscore development and one which is called underscore test. And sometimes stuff happens to the migrate or to the development that doesn't happen to the test. Usually if you just run that command, it'll work. So let's try running the test again. Okay, so good news. It looks like a lot of our tests are passing, which is great. And instead of testing some of the model stuff in Rails C, we also could have tested it using RSpec. That would have actually been a little bit faster. But there's still a whole bunch of non-passing tests here and there. Some of them are request specs. Request is like the full end-to-end test. It says, what happens when I make a request to this URL? Actually, they should all be request specs now that I think of it. So the failures are calendars get, calendars post, calendars, index show, or index create, show, update, delete for calendars, profiles, show, update, and delete. So let's add show, update, and delete for profiles. And I just want to briefly check in because it is 3:30. Colin, Mark, do I need to shut down?
Yeah, maybe next 10 minutes or so. Are
Okay.
you pretty close?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So show render JSON profile dot find params ID. Why ID? Is it because it's called ID in the database? No. The reason it's ID is that in here, it's called ID. When the URL is parsed for this particular request, it reads it and it takes whatever value was put after profiles and stores it in the params hash under the key ID. But sometimes they're called different things like profile ID, right? Or calendar ID. In this case, it's just ID. Similarly, let's just do destroy an S actually, because destroy is easy. Easy enough. You want to destroy something? Find it, destroy it. No questions there. All right, the last one is update. All right, so to update something, what you have to do is first you have to find the thing, and then you need to update it. So if we can update using whatever new properties come in, then render JSON P. And I don't recall if you need a special status code for that one. I don't know, or I'm not particularly interested. I don't care. So, and if it fails, p.errors. Now, what are the properties? Well, when you have an update, it's a patch or put, which means that there is an HTTP request body coming in. And where does it come in? Params. So just like with create, we want to use strong params when we call update. All right, let's run our tests. Okay, there are still failing tests, but none of those failing tests are for profiles. All of the profiles tests are passing. Awesome. One small point I'll make before moving on to the next controller. See how there's this like p profile.find, p profile.find, p profile.find, or just profile.find. This is kind of redundant code. So sometimes you'll see people write a helper method to deal with this. Might call it like set profile. It's less important here, but we're going to use something very similar to this in the next controller. So I'm just going to say at p, or at profile rather, would be better, equals profile.find params, oh gosh, find params colon ID. And then in all of these cases, just reference at profile instead of p. It does make the code a little bit more elegant. Right? It's a single line controller method. Another one. This is 5 lines. Strictly, it could even be 1 if you're really a fan of being concise. Okay, so we've got our controller. It's all set. And rerun the test just in case. Make sure we didn't break something. That's how you know you've refactored successfully. Oh, and we did. So good thing we checked. Profiles ID shows 1 profile. Ah, here's what we forgot. We're not actually calling it yet. It's the syntax for action. I'll just check my notes. Ah, okay, yep. Before action, set profile. So we want to call set profile before the following controller methods fire. Show, update, and destroy. Okay, so before any of these controller methods execute, set profile is going to run first. That's what before action does for us. All right, so let's run those tests again. And now profile spec is all good for a controller. See, calendars, 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 calendars. But nothing about profiles. Oh, that's a mistake. That should be events post, events post. Shoot, sorry, that's a mistake in my test output. Okay, calendars controller is next. So one thing of note about calendars controller is that the index and create actions of calendars happen at a different URL than show, update, and destroy. In fact, they happen nested inside profiles, which means that we have different data passed in from that kind of a request than we do for the other 3. Specifically, we have a profile that's indicated by profile ID. Let's use that profile. I'm going to copy the same set profile thing here. instead of ID, this time the ID for profile is called profile ID. And it's going to be called before index and create. Because those are the two actions that happen nested inside /profiles/profile ID. Why is that important? Well, when it comes to showing calendars, we're not showing all the calendars. We're showing the calendars associated with that profile ID. So rather than showing all of the calendars, we're going to show @profiles calendars. Okay. I'm going to set this off to the right so that we can use it as a reference. Away Robocop. Seriously. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what the hell is causing that. Okay, profile controller says we define a new profile, and if we can save it successfully, we have success. Same idea is going to apply here. We're going to say calendar is going to be a new calendar. And we'll want to define a calendar params method in a minute. If c.save, render c, else render c.errors. Okay, that's great. What's wrong with this? Can someone tell me what's wrong with this, what we're missing? What can't we do? We encountered this with Rails C. What can't we do?
You can't create a calendar on its own and needs to be attached to a profile.
That's precisely right. So let's attach a profile. And we'll have to define calendar params. So it's going to require calendar, which is going to sit at the root of the params hash when we send it. And then we will call require to pull in the keys that we want to actually allow to go on to the model. With the calendar, that's name, that's description, that is color, and that is visible. Fact check me on that. Is that right? Yeah, I think those are properties of a calendar. Okay, so this is going to ensure that our params are okay. We'll pass it into calendar. If it can save it successfully, then all is good. Okay. We're still having a problem. Wrong number of arguments. And so, oh, permit, not quiet there. Okay, so we have out of the 40 examples, out of the 40 tests, only 14 failures now. So get calendars, update calendars, so show, update, delete for calendars, and then CRUD for events down here. You can see event spec, calendar spec. Okay, I'm gonna run through this a little bit fast because it's long. I had doubts whether we'd be able to get through this in an hour, and I guess I was right. So in this case, we're going to say calendar.find params :id, and so on and so on. But I'm going to cheat because I know that I did this in profile. So I'm going to create a set calendar method. And that'll be my shortcut. So this is going to be just like it was in the other controller. And I only want to do that for show, update, and destroy. Does it work?
Hey, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
For the before stuff, how do you know which ones you want to do? Like for the before action, you're doing index and create, and then show, update, destroy. How is there anything that tells me which ones I want to do?
Sure. The reason that I want to run set calendar, which is set calendar defines at calendar.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to run that for show, update, and destroy because in all three cases, I need to find a specific calendar, which is referred to by the URL, right? In each of these three cases, the URL is going to have an ID for a particular calendar. Show is show one calendar. Update is update one calendar. Destroy is destroy one calendar. For create an index, you don't have the ID of a calendar. You don't have a calendar ID, so it's not possible to set a specific calendar that you're working with, and we're not using at calendar here. You're only using at calendar for show, update, and destroy.
Okay,
and the
that makes
reason we're
sense.
using set profile for these two is because the URL is /profiles. Oops. /profile ID /calendars for both of these two actions. So there's no calendar ID coming in from the URL, but there is a profile ID, which is actually all we need. We only need to know the profile ID to show all of a particular profile's calendars, and we only need a profile to create a new calendar.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. All right, I think I'm gonna cut it off here because I've cut longer in time than I wanted. I'm gonna post a full solution on this, and if you guys have other questions, just send me a direct message on Slack, and I'd be happy to help out. All right, Mark, sorry for running so long. I will turn that over to you.